Hi, welcome back to the sewing room. I'm Lara, and it is always such a bummer when your machine isn't sewing right, but today I'm going to talk to you about 5 things that could be causing the problem that aren't actually wrong with your sewing machine or your technique. Let's take a look. I know I keep saying this. As always, suspect number 1 is not a great sewing needle. Is your needle at least relatively new? Is it inserted into your machine correctly? Is it inserted into the machine all the way? It's very easy to accidentally only put the needle partway up and then put the clamp down and think you're good, when in fact the needle is too low and needs to be up a little bit higher in the machine. So always check that very first thing. Number 2, do you have not great thread? Now, brand names aren't like super important to me, and I do use a lot of all-purpose polyester sewing thread. For some applications you want specialty threads, but that is the thread I use the most because most of my sewing is pretty much all-purpose sewing. But if your thread is old or brittle, has been stored maybe in a basement for more than 10 years or in direct sunlight for really any amount of time, that thread might have had its best days already in the past. So thread doesn't have to be super expensive, but really cheap thread is a false economy, because in the end it'll lint more, it'll cause you more problems with the machine, it won't sew as well, it might even ruin your sewing projects, and nobody wants that. So spend a little money and get a good high quality thread that isn't a million years old and to make sure you're going to have a better time sewing. Now this third one is whenever this is the problem, I get kind of mad at myself because it's so obvious, but I don't always think to check it first. So we're going to take a closer look at where our thread is on our machine. Alright, closer look achieved. As you can see, this machine is actually designed to hold 2 spools of thread. That's for some, kind of fun tricks you can do with this machine. Of course, you can always just use 1 spool if that's all you need. But first thing, does your spool have its little felt helper underneath, or is it missing? This does a couple things. It helps protect the machine from wear, but it also helps this unspool a little bit more smoothly, and that's what you want. You don't want to be hitting resistance back here when your thread is unspooling. So basically, there's a couple of different troubleshooting tips to do with this exact thing, but spooling, do you have your little guy underneath? But then also, some spools of thread will have a little notch or cut or roughness in the top of the spool. Sometimes that's on purpose. Sometimes you're supposed to kind of catch your thread under there so that it doesn't unwind in storage. Most newer spools do seem to have this kind of more lip feature instead, where you can kind of lead it in between 2 discs and get it to stay, which is great. As you can see from a mess of threads back there, I don't really get too worked up about that. But if there is any roughness or weirdness around the top of your spool that's catching your thread, the machine is not going to sew right. And if that's happening, it doesn't mean you can't use that thread, but try flipping it over to see if that helps. And last thing about the spool thread area, every once in a while, as you are getting going, something will happen where the thread will kind of backlash itself around the bottom of the spool. And if that happens, sometimes it just keeps getting tighter and tighter and tighter, and that's not great. So just take a quick peek, again checking to make sure our little felt helper is underneath, but then also making sure the thread isn't doing something it's not supposed to do on the way to the top threading. Number 4, does your thread thickness match your needle thickness? All-purpose thread is generally designed to work with a needle size from about 70 to about 90, and that's size 10 to 14 in the other system. Buttonhole, jean, and top stitching thread are also very thick thread, like this upholstery extra strong thread. Will not work with those size needles. You can maybe try one of these with a 90, but if you have any trouble at all, definitely opt for a slightly larger needle. I usually do start these at a 100 size needle. which is a 16 in the other system. And most of the time that works, but you definitely want that to match. What happens if it doesn't, if this is too thick? Then what happens is, as it's going through the fabric into the fabric to sew, the needle will actually kind of shred it, because the size of the needle hole is too small for the thread to really get through very well. So it snags, which then wears it, which breaks your thread, which is annoying. The fifth reason your machine is not sewing well or is shredding up your thread and making your sewing a nightmare could be if your needle and fabric are mismatched. This is most of my needle collection. I do have some others elsewhere, but as you can see, lots of different kinds here, lots of different sizes. I'm actually kind of out of some right now. I need to get some more. But you basically choose the type of needle to match your fabric. There's a wonderful chart from Schmetz needles. I will have a link in the show notes, which of course points out all of the different needle types that they make, but you could apply the information to any brand of sewing needle. And you can see that for me, as for thread, I do typically gravitate toward, a couple different brands. And in needles and in thread, I don't entirely believe that there's one perfect, wonderful brand, but I do like what I call name brands. So basically, Schmetz is fantastic. I've never had a bad experience with them. Singer is great. But bargain bin needles, just like bargain bin thread, are not going to actually do you very much good. You want to choose a brand you can trust to care for your sewing and make sure that your machine's going to sew well. I will probably do another video later about matching your needle to your fabric, but just so that you know, that can also be one of the culprits.